welcome everyone to another episode of Everything Imaginable. I am your host, Gary Cacciolillo. And before we get started, I want to thank everybody for listening and also thank the contributors to the show, who are Candace Sanderson, author of The Reluctant Messenger, Joseph Simkovic, author of How to Kiss the Universe, Ms. Aida, author, psychic, spellcaster, root worker, and witch. You can find her at MissAida.com, MISSAIDA. And this episode is being sponsored by Ginger Glasser. You can find Ginger at tarotbyginger.com. She's a tarot reader, evidential medium, and healer. And it is at tarotbyginger.com. And this episode is also being sponsored by Alan Questel. And you can find Alan at uncommonsensing.com. As the word uncommon sensing, SESING.com. And you can also look for his new book on Amazon called Intentional Acts of Kindness. And now, without further ado, our guest for today is Stephen Gray, and he is the editor, co-contributor of How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. And he also has a few other books too on cannabis and other medicines, I guess we'll call them. Thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here again, Gary. This is our third time.
Always a pleasure. So we were talking before the show about what we were going to talk about. And we were going to talk a little bit about cannabis. And, cannabis is a big topic because it's becoming legal finally after 1,000 years. I don't know how to use that, but at least I have to say, like, since the 70s, prohibition. So, what do you think? What are the benefits of this? What are the benefits of us making this change?
Well, okay, so here's, there's a lot of different ways to talk about that. Thank you for the question, Gary. First of all, this is the people's plant. I like to think of it as the people's plant. One of the contributors to the cannabis book that you referred to, and by the way, this is it. It surprised me at how well it's done.
I read it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I had no idea it was going to do that well. At the moment, it's still selling fairly well after 7 years. I think it's sold over 25,000 copies now. So it obviously hit the zeitgeist. But just regarding our relationship with this plant, it's always been there. First of all, the lineage that cannabis comes from goes back, and they estimate between 30 and 90 million years. So the plant and its relatives have been on this planet since far longer than humans have. So, as soon as we became humans, because that was sort of a gradual development or whatever from whatever we were before that, say 15,000 years ago or so, or maybe much longer, with some of our relatives like the Neanderthal and other similar species. It was around. It had to be around. It grows so easily, right? And, before we had grocery stores, you didn't have the luxury of not knowing everything in your neighborhood that could be used for food, medicine, clothing, building materials, whatever, right? And so cannabis has been used, we only have written records going back to, I don't know, maybe 2,000-3,000 years before the common or Christian era. But it's, there's pottery records and things that go back beyond that. And certainly since then, there's just immense evidence of multiple uses for cannabis. It's been throughout Asia. It's been used for a large variety of medicinal reasons and so on and so on. But my focus has been on cannabis as a spiritual ally because in our modern culture, let me back up just a second first. So in most places, it was legal until the 20th century. It's the people's plant. It's been around forever, right? And in the United States, people don't know this history. They might be a little shocked to know that you could go into any apothecary, which is kind of like the predecessors of pharmacies, I suppose, and ask for cannabis, and they had it. They had it, they had it for in tinctures, and they had it in all these different forms. People used it for a variety of medical reasons, and people were writing about it, for spiritual use as well. A famous
Mhm.
book, I don't remember the name of the book, but the guy's name was Fitzhugh Ludlow, I think. And he wrote a book on hashish and his experience with large amounts of, I think, orally ingested hashish. And it's very powerful spiritual stuff and experience. So it is our plant, and it's in the United States. It was only made illegal in 1937,
Mm.
and that was only for it wasn't mostly sort of moralistic. It was mostly capitalistic or opportunism. They used well, okay, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I don't want to go into all the history, but there are some really good books on the history, like Smoke Signals, for example, by Martin A. Lee and a couple of others. Um, but basically, I think it was the precursor to the FBI, or maybe to the DEA. It was called the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. I think it was started in 1930 by a real piece of work named Harry J. Anslinger, and he was looking for accreditation, respect, and money for this new federal organization, and so he thought he picked on cannabis and other drugs. And that meant picking on Black people and minorities like Mexican
Mhm.
immigrants and whatnot. So they created all these false stories. Some people have heard of the movie Reefer Madness, which just, did
Mhm.
you ever see it, Gary?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I saw it.
Oh, it's just ridiculous. It's disgusting, really. And and then they got some of the media to pitch in. William Randolph Hearst, I think it was the San Francisco Examiner was his paper. Was it San Francisco Daily anyway? And he started putting in these scare stories about, like turning, American blacks into maniacs on cannabis. They claimed it was more dangerous than heroin. It was just
Right.
ridiculous. So that was the beginning of the end for cannabis that way. And then uh, in the big backlash, the sort of freak out that happened in the 1960s, when the hippies were threatening to turn the United States into a sane country, um, the authorities and others freaked out and threw all these drugs, all these substances, plant medicines, into Schedule 1, which is no known medical use and a high potential for addiction or abuse. And they threw cannabis in there too. It's in the same category as heroin and cocaine and some other drugs, like including the psychedelics. So that's all ridiculous. But yes, as you say, it's coming back now, of course, about time, and that will continue, I'm sure. It's just like obvious in a way, right? And so education and knowledge and experience will trump stigma and ignorant suspicions and all that kind of stuff. So your question essentially was, though, how can it help? So that's I'll try that one next, unless you want to say anything or ask in between.
How can it help?
How can it help? Yeah. So, oh, you're in a jolly mood today, Gary. Yeah. Um, okay. So there are, again, different ways to think about it. Let's try a couple of them. One is that we have this extensive receptor system in our bodies that's known as the cannabinoid receptor system, or the endocannabinoid receptor system, and endo meaning inner. Cannabis is an exocannabinoid, or exo meaning outside, right? Like an exoskeleton that some creatures have. Yeah. Anyway, um, our minds and bodies are highly attuned to this medicine. It's non-toxic. I mean, yes, you could throw up on it if you have a lot of it. You can definitely freak out if you have too much of it, especially orally. You can have paranoid experiences and different things like that. You can have nausea, dizziness, different things like that can happen, but it's not toxic. The wonderful old singer-songwriter Willie Nelson once said, and he was a lifelong cannabis lover, and advocate, and he once said the only way you could ever get killed by cannabis is if a large bale of it fell off a truck and landed on you, right? It's that safe.
Hmm.
You couldn't possibly. There's a term called LD50. It's a medical term. Uh, Lethal dose 50. It's the dosage of any medicine or any drug, including alcohol, which definitely has an LD50, at which 50% of the people who take that dosage will die. Alcohol has one. It's like 32 ounces in 24 hours or something like that will kill you, 50% of the people. Cannabis doesn't have an LD50, right? So it's safe. That's really important, to understand. So another way of thinking about it is that it's a non-specific or unspecific amplifier. I think of it as a very gracious, flexible, kind medicine. And it's kind in the sense of it's like a laissez-faire kind of parent. You can abuse it, and you can just do that. You can abuse it. So it's what you do with that amplification. You can use it to escape. You can use it to numb yourself. You can use it to try to counteract boredom. Like some people like to use it to clean their house, or paint the walls because they find that stuff boring. And cannabis kind of, as my old friend Neil used to say, puts a shine on things. And, you know, I don't have any, obvious, clear objection to people doing that,
Hmm.
but it's definitely not the kind of use that I think people, is really good for people to hear about if they're at all interested. And that is cannabis as a spiritual aid or ally. So how does that work? Well, again, it amplifies experience. So it's like gives you a this is not a complete description, obviously, and the medical people, scientists will add things to that, of course. But it gives you a temporary state of enhanced perception, right? Like people talk about increased visual acuity. You look at a painting or something, or something in nature, a beautiful flower, and it seems to be even more beautiful. You learn to appreciate that way. It's well known that music and cannabis are intimately engaged with each other. So many people just love to hear music under the influence of cannabis. There's a whole bunch of things that are enhanced on our sense level. Taste. The munchies and stuff. By the way, just a little sidebar here. I don't remember the details, but the editor of Common Ground, the original one down in California, a couple of years ago, asked me to write an article on the munchies. So I did some research and I found out the munchies is a trick, like with cannabis. If you had, say, a normal dinner, and then you at 9 o'clock, let's say you normally would not be hungry. You had a good sized meal, right? You smoke some cannabis in between time, and now you want to eat, but you're no more hungry than you would have been had you not smoked that pot. It doesn't get rid of the food in your stomach any faster or aid the digestion process any faster, as far as I know. It plays havoc with some of the chemical configurations in your brain that make you think you're hungry. So that's a pretty interesting one. And for people that don't want to gain weight, you might just try disciplining yourself a little that way and just not eat because you didn't actually need that food. But anyway, it certainly tastes good if it's, so all that stuff, all those senses are temporarily amplified or enhanced, right? But it also has this, what you might loosely define as a spiritual amplification potential as well. That requires you to channel, well, maybe it requires you in the first place to treat the plant as a sacred medicine, for one thing. Maybe it would be helpful if you do that. I think. Think of yourself as working with a psychedelic. It is, in some respects, a psychedelic. It is a sacred plant. It is an ancient sacred plant, and so that might help. and then the situation that you do it in, the intention you have. If your intention is to kind of spiritually heal or spiritually go deeper, you might say, uh, that energy, that temporary amplified energy that cannabis gives you, can be directed like that. And so there are ways to make that more likely to happen. And the purest way, and I talk about this one and I write about it because, by the way, there are 17 other contributors in cannabis and spirituality, but I and others talk about, uh, just, as Terence McKenna might have said about psychedelics, sit down, shut up, and pay attention. Um, and that is essentially the sort of layman's description of the ultimate sort of pure version of meditation. Meditation in its purest form is, it's almost not a practice at all. It's not like an add-on. It's just how we can, in a sense, focus our minds to be in the present. So maybe that requires like a quick, sort of like 25 or words less Buddhist lesson here. It's not just Buddhism by any means. Anyone who's worked with their minds thoroughly would understand this. Uh, there is an awakened state. That's like the core teaching of universal teaching of Buddhism. The word Buddha simply means awake, and the Buddha, the historical Buddha, wasn't never considered to be a a god. Like he wasn't he wasn't born from a virgin, or like the son of God or any of that kind of thing. He was just a man who discovered this truth that we are by nature these awakened beings, that it's like ultimate stillness of mind and peace and open heart. The Tibetan Buddhist translation for enlightenment essentially is awakened heart. In Sanskrit, it's bodhicitta, bodhi meaning awakened, citta meaning both mind and heart together, like synchronized that way. So, but the problem is that from the time, pretty much from the time we're born, and many would say formed from past lives as well, we are forming an identity, which Buddhists would call the ego. And we do that because it's overwhelming to be in this world. If we don't know what's going on or who we are, so we have to, and we have to cope. Not all of us, equally successfully, of course, but if you make it to adulthood and you're a relatively successfully functioning, with your various warts and wounds, but still, able to go out, work in the world, have relations and all that, you have by then formed a quite definite, distinct identity by which you've decided how to cope with the world, right? And this just tells you, where you want to be, where you don't want to be, what you think is real and not real, what you believe, what you disbelieve, what you feel is safe and unsafe, or, all that stuff. But that's all concepts. And it lives in thought. It essentially, it gets embodied, of course, and many people in the healing professions understand that we embody, or there's an imprint of all our conceptual, stances, so to speak, in various places in our body, and the things that we hold on to in our various wounds and all that. But these concepts that, as a package, create this thing we could call ego. They exist. They don't. This is a core Buddhist teaching. They don't actually exist in reality. They're just held in, like, RAM. They're held in software, so to speak. And if you deleted that, then you'd still be here, but those concepts wouldn't be ruling you or driving you, right? So, but the problem is that for almost all of us, we're so attached to that identity that having it stripped away from us can be very challenging, very threatening, very scary. And that's what the psychedelics do, or can do, when they're used properly. And cannabis also can do that. we can, as I say, take that uh, temporarily amplified, enhanced energy, and we can channel it into being present. And so the reason I mentioned this thing about ego and the identity packages is that the way that this is, again, a sort of a core Buddhist teaching, but understood by many kind of mystics and spiritual people around the planet, I'm sure, is that the way that we protect ourselves within that identity is by throwing up a kind of an ink cloud of overlapping thinking. So we just keep our minds busy most of the time, right? And leaving a gap in that, if we are able to leave a gap in there, as I say, can be threatening. It can be totally scary because that you can be unraveling this identity. But the great teachers and the mystics are saying that is the path, that is the gateway into our true nature, into the awakened self that is, the same availability to everybody. Well, maybe not equally the same, but it's our true nature anyway. So, excuse me. So to encourage and develop that ability or that state of mind, that sort of at rest or default state, you might even say, requires allowing some of the thoughts to dissipate and entering in the gap. The great mystic poet Rumi said things like, silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. In other words, silence meaning the quieting of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the hardest thing for almost all of us to do. Like, can you, or anyone watching or listening to this, and I include myself in this, could you sit down on a cushion with a straight back, follow your breath for half an hour and not have a thought?
No.
I don't think so. Although Eckhart Tolle claims that he can, or certainly could when he wrote the book The Power of Now. He said he could basically sit for 2 hours without a thought, really. So some people can do that. And the more we have, in a sense, allowed our obstacles and wounds and fear of the awakened state to come up and be released, the easier it is to do that. So that the path quality there seems to be that the more we've healed, in a sense, the more we've processed, the materials that block us, in a sense, from that awakened state, the easier it becomes to rest in that state. Buddhist teaching says, rest in the nature of alaya, which is like your true nature, right? Learn to rest in that state. So it's hard for most people to even understand that as a concept, let alone as a practice, right? But that's what the path is, And when I say the path, it doesn't belong to any religion. It just belongs to all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are teachings that help with it, but it's not about saying, well, Christianity is the way, or Buddhism is the way, or Islam is the way, or any of that kind of thing, right? It's like everybody is capable of practicing in that way, of paying attention to the thoughts that arise. No praise, no blame, just release them, come back to the present. And as Eckhart Tolle says, you could do that anywhere. You don't have to be sitting on a cushion to do that. You could do that while you're waiting for a bus, or washing the dishes, or sitting in a chair at the office. You could just go, check in with the body, the breath. Am I having, obviously we need to think, but again, the Buddhist teaching, the universal teaching, is that the thinking mind is how we create this cloud of obscurity, which blocks us from understanding our true nature. It doesn't let the light in, so to speak. So the question is, the thinking that you're doing at any given moment, is it necessary, or is it just part of this sort of like running program to keep us distracted and occupied, so to speak? Eckhart Tolle, again, good on that one. He said, the relationship, I'm not quoting him word for word, if people know his material well, or go to check this out in the book. This is just the gist of it, right? So he said something like, the relationship you want with your thinking mind is that you can treat it like a tool, that you can pick it up when you need to use it, but you're fully capable of putting it down when you don't need it, when you don't need to be using it, right? So that's the approach that we're talking about. So the purest way that you would use cannabis that way is just to sit down, shut up, and pay attention. The sit straight so that energy moves. Um, there's a wonderful guy named Ganesh Baba. He was the crazy wisdom guru of cannabis from India. He's passed away now, but he was a real character. You can find some of his writings
Mm.
online here and there. And he said, here's my whole Bible, my canon, of how to work with that plant. He said, first of all, sit up with a straight spine so that your energy moves and you stay alert, right? Secondly, dedicate your smoking to Shiva, which Shiva is the Lord of Bong or the Lord of Cannabis in India. But from my point of view, that could be any source,
Mhm.
the Latin Americans from South America and places call it Santa Maria, Saint Mary, call her Santa Maria. Yeah, so that's it. Two things, right? Sit straight, pay attention, dedicate your smoking. That's that sort of treating it as a sacred plant kind of idea, right? And then, and again, the sort of universal practice, the purest way is just sit there and allow whatever comes up to come up. Is it restlessness? Fine. It's just, in a sense, a thought, that's generated by, this kind of concept that, oh, I have to be somewhere else, or this is irritating, or this is boring, or any of those kind of things. Just treat them all as no praise, no blame thinking, right? And just let it go and come back. And that's essentially just the simple universal practice of meditation as taught by Buddhists and other traditions. But where cannabis comes in is the amplification effect. So that if you can do that, even if it's just for gaps, like again, don't expect yourself to be able to, most people anyway, to sort of sit down, shut up, and pay attention without thinking for half an hour. But even if you can allow 2-3 minutes of complete empty mind, so to speak, in there, you can enter deeper and deeper and deeper into it's your own self, in a sense, right? It's your truer nature. It's the capital S self instead of the small s, ego identified self. It can open you up into that true nature. It can you can relax into it, and it typically comes along with an opening of the heart, a tenderness in that way as well. So that was a very long monologue, Gary. I think I'll stop there and allow you to weigh in or ask a question or something.
I understand the amplification effects of cannabis, but one of the effects that I know that I feel sometimes though is the observer effect, where all of a sudden I become the observer of my thoughts. Like there's like this
Mhm.
little gap that's created between I don't know what, but all of a sudden my thoughts will become more pronounced to me. And
Mhm.
it's like I'm watching the pronounced thoughts. Like I'm supposed to be it's like meditating, but not meditating, it just happens like in this natural way.
Mhm.
Is that something that everybody experiences when using cannabis?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand that way of thinking about it. To me, there's almost two kinds of observers. One is the one that's keeping us, in a sense, from being completely entered or empty into the moment, right? You're sort of holding yourself back.
Yeah,
But then
not
there's
that
the
observer, the other
okay, then
observer.
there's the other observer is just, I don't know. I guess I more likely think of it as just like a sharper awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah, you notice these thoughts up. And so, by the way, that's part of the challenge of working with cannabis, and something to really pay attention to in general with cannabis, but maybe specifically in this case, working with it as a spiritual ally, is that um, uh, that amplification effect tends to make thoughts seem bigger, more important, more serious, et cetera, et cetera. I wish I had the lyrics in front of me, but there's a wonderful old song. It was popularized by a famous jazz guy named Cab Calloway back in the 30s called The Reefer Man. And it had all these wonderful lines in it like, there were the, you know, that was the black people were, especially in the music world, were smoking a lot of cannabis in those days, and so they noticed and they were making fun of this type of person who would, you know, he said, what's it goes, let's see, if he said he swam to China and he'll sell you Carolina, you know you're talking to the reefer man, right? In other words, you get all these, oh, I'm really excited about this idea and this idea and this idea.
Hmm.
And that can be both positive and quote unquote negative because you can have, you know, this sort of self-sabotaging ideation coming up and seeming more important. It's kind of like you can get cannabis is a nowness meditation, and it's sort of it amplifies whatever your state of mind is. So if your state of mind is paranoia or self-doubt or fear, you can amplify all that stuff too. So that's why I said at the beginning it's a really gracious plant. So I'm not quite sure
So I'll give
how
here's
you experience the observer.
here's an example.
Yeah. Okay.
When it happens to me, like, and I think this must be common too, because the laughing thing is common, you know, where you find
Oh
everything
yeah.
humorous, and
Yeah.
it's almost like, you know, looking out from the outside in and seeing actually how humorous things are that I'm been taking like really seriously, kind of thing.
Okay.
Does that kind of give you a better idea of what I'm trying to?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call that the observer myself or not, but I know what you mean. Uh, so another way that I think of cannabis, because it does have this ability, is it's a truth serum.
Hmm.
I think of it as a reality medicine, you know,
Hmm.
and that's one of the reasons why it's tough for some people, because it is threatening this, you know, habitual pattern thing and giving you a larger perspective. Um, it's interesting that you say, you know, regarding laughing to sort of, you know, you stand back and you find things that you maybe took seriously to be funny.
Yeah.
Um, uh, because my old Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, he talked about humor and what sense of
Hmm.
humor really is. And sense of humor, he called it panoramic perspective, you know, where you sort of, you know, look at the things that you've been taking seriously and you go, oh, you know, like that's funny that we take ourselves so seriously. There is that aspect of it, that we and other people take ourselves, you know, so seriously a lot of the time, right?
Right.
That's the kind of panoramic perspective. You know, you could humor and joy are actually quite related. The If you take that kind of, maybe in a sense sort of bigger, that same teacher used the term, something about primordial awareness or something like that. Oh, pardon me. He called it the primordial smile. It's
Hmm.
like when when you've been able to, you know, and let's be honest about this, it's a lifetime process. It's not like cannabis or psychedelics or any kind of therapy or anything at all, including changing your mind, is
Right.
going to suddenly turn you around and make you a completely different person. You have to unwind these things, unravel them, allow them to come up, be exposed and released, etc. And that, for pretty much everybody, is a lifetime's work.
Deprogramming. Like,
Yeah, deprogramming, good one. Yeah, deconstructing, in a sense, this, you know, kind of entangled configuration of thoughts and ideas and concepts that you've put together.
mhm.
Um, now, okay, now I forgot why I mentioned that one in particular. So let's carry on again. Oh yeah, yeah, we were talking about humor, and that panoramic perspective, I guess. But I think we nailed that one.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so how you know you put it sometimes like in the same category as a psychedelic, but yet when people use cannabis, there's
Yeah.
no hallucinations or audio things happening. Like to me, they seem still different. You know, like
Right.
using psilocybin versus cannabis.
Psilocybin, you mean psilocybin,
Psilocybin,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Excuse me. Well, yes and no. The terms, first of all, you know, taking it literally, the word psychedelic, psyche is psyche, right? The mind, the soul. And delic has something to do with manifesting. So psychedelic from the Greek means mind manifesting or soul manifesting, right? So cannabis can do that. The other word that for a while seemed like it was going to, you know, push past psychedelic into the number one position, but has more recently kind of fallen back again as we've gotten far enough away from the baggage that the word used to carry back in the 60s and 70s, is entheogens, and meaning in, theo meaning God or spirit, and gen meaning generating. So generating the spirit or divine or God within, and cannabis can do that. And in fact, oh yes, you can have hallucinations. That's dose dependent. Uh,
Mhm.
I have, if I have with eyes closed, I have some beautiful visuals sometimes, and that's on smoking or inhaling. But orally, there's almost no limit, and it can get really bizarre. Actually, can create. It's unusual in the psychedelic realm that way. In the sensual, the sense perception distortions that cannabis can generate. That doesn't tend to happen in my experience with other psychedelics. Um, like, for example, I have this wonderful book back in my shelves called Orgies of the Hemp Eaters. And it's a tongue in cheek title because some, conservative person once said that about cannabis, right? Um, and these two authors collected all kind. The British spent a long time in India where there was a lot of cannabis, and they experienced cannabis a lot as hashish, oftentimes, and in drinks and things, where it's most potent. And
Called
then they wrote
bong.
about it.
Those,
Bong,
yeah.
exactly. You can still get bong lassis in places like Varanasi and so on. In fact, a couple of my friends about 15 or 20 years ago were in Varanasi, and somebody offered them a bong lassi. They didn't think anything about what the dosage was in that. They were basically pinned to their bed for 2 days, right? Could barely move. Uh, um, um, so anyway, there's all these great stories in that book that I just mentioned, and you'd have these guys saying, well, they took a large dosage, and they had some friends around them or something, and it was kind of an experiment. This one I particularly remember, and he heard a really loud explosion, and it shocked him. And he sort of sat up and said, "What was that?" And his friends said, "Oh, that was a pin dropping on the floor." You know, like that's how dramatic the perceptual distortions can be. And then there was this group called the Club des Hachishans or something like that, the Hash Club of France, back in the, I think, 1840s, maybe 40s and 50s. It was a group of artists and intellectuals, some very famous ones. Charles Baudelaire was one of them, and a few others that were well known. They had a patron who was very wealthy, and he had this mansion. And they would go over there, I don't know, once a month or something like that. And he had these sticky, gooey black hash balls that he'd gotten from Arabia or Turkey or somewhere, right? And they'd have a dinner, and they'd stick these things into their coffee, and stir them around until they melted, and then they'd drink them. And then they just kind of go off on their own, in the house. And they tell stories like one guy said he was absolutely convinced it was taking him 1,000 years to walk up the spiral staircase, this distortion of time, for example.
Mhm.
Another guy sat in the living room where the fire was on, and he said he saw gargoyles coming out of the fire. So there's, oh, and here's another good story, I would say, anyway, which puts the plant into a really nice perspective from my point of view. Um, uh, this was a guy named Sebastião. He was called Padrino or Padrino Sebastião. Padrino means like father in the Christian way. They'd say Father Brown or whatever, right? Or something like that. Like Padre is father in Spanish, for
Mhm.
example. Anyway, he had a community in they were ayahuasca using religion that he had, and he was the head of this community in the Amazonian jungle. And this is back in the 70s, I think. And for some reason, I guess he hadn't really, the way I heard the story was he hadn't really been around cannabis for some reason, or he hadn't tried it or something, or it just wasn't around him. But word of this community kind of spread, and some young, long-haired kind of hippie guy showed up at the encampment one time, and he had some weed with him. He had some cannabis with him, and he felt kind of embarrassed about it because this was sort of a spiritual community, and they were using ayahuasca as a sacred medicine. He didn't know if that would be okay. He didn't know quite what to do with it, so he went to Sebastião and he said, "I've got this stuff, and would you could you tell me what to do with it?" And he said, "Well, give it to me, and I'll find out for myself what this plant actually is." So he smoked some, apparently, and he had a vision, and he was in the vision, and he found himself in a garden, and there was a woman in the garden, and she was kind of walking around tending to the plants in the garden, and she saw him and turned to him and came over and obviously recognized him as a leader of a community. And she said, "Yes, that plant you smoked, that's mine. This is my garden, and that's my plant. And by the way, I would like you to go back to your people and teach them how to use this plant in a sacred way." And he identified her because that was a syncretic church that had elements of Christianity involved in it. He identified her as Saint Mary, hence the term Santa Maria, which is used by many people in different places these days. So, yes, indeed, you can have some very strong visions. So, in that sense, it's not that different. I mean, it has its unique way, but it's not that sort of ultimately different from what it's capable of doing, for what it's capable of doing to other psychedelics. Terence McKenna acknowledged that as well. He said, intentionally used in the right way with the right dosage, cannabis has almost the full array of psychedelic effects as the other psychedelics. And ultimately, as I understand it, many other people understand it, what the best use or best capability of psychedelics is to bring us into reality, is to perhaps bring up the things that need to be healed, and enter us or invite us into the unconditional space of divine reality, etc. Well, cannabis can do that too, and in fact, some people might accuse me of being biased. I don't consider myself biased about this, because I have great respect for all the psychedelics, and I've used a bunch of them, and number of them quite a lot over the years. And it's just that cannabis, because of its ubiquity, the fact that it's sort of everywhere and people use it so casually, and it seems so mild a lot of the times, it's not understood in the same way. So it needs to be taught, or it needs education to let people know that if you use it in these ways, it too can open you up that way. And in some ways, it has some distinct advantages over some of these other psychedelics because, as you mentioned at the outset, Gary, first of all, it's legal in a lot of places. It's federally legal in the whole country of Canada, where I live, and it's legal in a few other countries, and it's legal in at least half of your states now, or something like that. Anyway, so it's universally available. It's non-toxic. It's generally safe. And its way of helping people enter into this more unconditioned reality space is it is gentle in a way. It can be really, really powerful, but even that power has a sort of a gentle potential if you can relax into it. Okay, so that is a segue from my point of view into the discussion of dosage, because I think dosage is really important. That's my experience.
So how does a person get the right dosage? And is the dosage different when you're using an edible versus when you're smoking it?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about edibles first. There's a saying around these days, start low and go slow. So you can't really know the effects of any particular batch, or whatever you want to call it, any particular strain, cultivar, until you try it. And that's one of the beautiful things of cannabis is that, it's very easy to self-experiment with in that way. But especially with edibles, and many people know this. I'm sure many of the people who are going to watch or listen to this interview will know this. It can be overwhelming. You have to be really careful with dosage. And, I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners will also know either from their own personal experience or from their friends or whatever, some, kind of classic stories about that. One of the most common or classic story about overdosing with edible cannabis, like we're talking brownies or anything that you take in orally, is if you don't know that it takes quite a long time to kick in, and even longer if you do it after you've eaten. It can, if you have like a brownie or something shortly after eating any substantial size of a meal, it
Mhm.
could take up to 2 hours to reach its full effect. And even if you take it, 3 hours or 4 hours after eating, it can still take up to an hour and a half or so to reach full effect. So the classic mistake that you hear jokes kind of about is you eat your brownie, and you're sitting there with your friend, and half an hour, 45 minutes later, you look at each other and you go, "Are you off yet? Are you high yet?" And you look at each other and go, "No, are you?" And so you have a second one. Well, the first one hasn't even really kicked in yet, right? Um, we all know stories like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it can be overwhelming. And as I say, it has this other potential of wild sense distortions. Wild, like I mentioned, like the sound of a pin sounding, or I mean, the dropping of a pin sounding like a loud explosion, or time being wildly distorted with these higher doses. It can just essentially disable you, and it can also scare the crap out of people. My family doctor, uh, he doesn't like cannabis. And I said, why? And he said, well, my only contact with cannabis is people who I hear from or about who were freaking out, right? They've taken too much and they have some kind of fear or paranoid reaction, or they get nausea, dizziness, and things like that are reactions to having done too much. Although the interesting thing about done too much is that it's also a learning process, as it is with other psychedelics. For example, with peyote, people throw up a lot, but it tends to be the newbies that throw up. The old folks that have been doing it for 10, 20 years, they don't throw up much at all. And once you get used to it, you'll learn how to surrender to it. So it's, um, uh, as I say, cannabis threatens or wants to pull you out of that habitual kind of conceptual based ego, etc. It wants to take you out of that, and that can be scary. Like, oh my God, I feel so vulnerable or exposed or whatever. And one of the ways that that manifests is through physical symptoms like nausea and dizziness, for example, right? So yeah, so that's the edible aspect of things. Start low, like really low, you know. You got to know what you're dealing with that, with edibles. If you know the measurement of it, and if you, well, let's be clear about this. If you're smoking every day, if you're a wake and bake type person, then your tolerance level's gone way up and you can handle a lot more, and it won't have the same strength of effect. But if you're new to it, or you haven't smoked for a week or two or whatever, or taken any cannabis, it's going to be a lot different. But if you can go to a shop where they've measured it, like you can get candies and gummies and all these things, and they'll say there's 5 milligrams of THC in it,
Mhm.
or 10 milligrams. 5 milligrams is kind of like a microdose, but some people, including cheap dates like me, will notice five milligrams, even though I've got 50 years of experience with this plant. And so then you could start with 5 milligrams, for example, and see, oh well, I didn't really notice any effect from that, or it was pretty mild. So the next time, you could take 10, right?
Mhm.
And or 20 or whatever, or 2 10s, or any of that kind of thing. And similarly with inhaled cannabis, a lot of the cannabis that's around these days is super strong. Even a lot of old time smokers don't really like this new cannabis because, or newish, because like two tokes and it's psychedelic. That's actually how I experience cannabis now. I mean, I'll have one toke to start. A lot of times I do kind of what I've been describing. I'll maybe once a week I'll sit down on my meditation cushion and I'll start with one. It'll be a large toke, or hid, or whatever young people call them these days. My generation called it a toke usually, so I stick with that one. And anyway, one large toke, I'm good to go for an hour or so. And then oftentimes I'll do a top up then, which will take me a little higher, but I know where I'm at then. I know what my plateau is.
Mhm.
And both another very experienced cannabis using friend of mine and I have talked about how it's often, even for experienced people, it's often good to start a little under what you might think you need in that way and just sit with it. It'll be have a its effect will kick in immediately, within a minute or two. Although, quite honestly, if you're sitting in meditation, you're essentially deepening your experience anyway. So that and the cannabis will work together, and over several minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes or even longer, will continue to deepen. But what we found is if we don't overdo it, like we don't come in and have two giant hoovers right off the bat, we usually have a better experience than if we kind of like, light the fire to the rocket ship right off the get-go. And then, you can still have a top up 10 minutes later, half an hour later, an hour later, right? Um, so that's what I mean by getting the dosage right. So here's a simple little sentence or phrase that I think could be very useful for people. The optimal dosage for this kind of work, but maybe just in general, but it's especially for spiritual use of cannabis. The optimal dose is the dose that you both want to and can handle, right? So the want to part is how deep do you want to go? Because you can go quite deep. The can handle part is, excuse me, the dosage within which you can stay calm, your mind isn't running out of control, you're not getting dizzy, or with some people it's sleepy. Now that comes into strains, which is another important topic. But some people just get sleepy on any cannabis, and that's because they never normally slow down enough. They're running on a lot, and so they have a couple of puff and they relax and they go. That's also taking them out of their sort of habitual zone, right? And but that's a kind of an instinctual way of avoiding this invitation into reality that cannabis potentially has, right?
Mhm.
So then maybe I'll just say a word about cultivars or strains then. Uh, as I mentioned a few moments ago, self-experimentation is, cannabis's forte, sort of, among psychedelics. Is safe to do that, and there's so many different choices of, blends and hybrids and sativa versus indica and all this. So let's clarify the sativa indica dichotomy for starters. What I've read is that it's impossible to know ahead of time until you've experienced a strain, whether it's sativa or indica, because there's been so much hybridization for the last several decades or whatever. So they originally were different plants. One was sort of tall and thin, the other one was short and bushy, right? But apparently, the only way you can know now is after the fact. You know, so what people associate with indica is, sometimes it might be helpful to think indica couch, can be soporific, drowsy inducing, sleepy, chill out kind of, whatever.
Mhm.
And the sativas are supposedly uplifting, cerebral, energizing, and all that kind of thing. But you can only really find that out by experimenting or by asking people who know that strain. Like if you go into a shop and they say, oh yeah, well, this is a sativa leaning hybrid, and that's based not on somebody just saying it is because they claim it's based on hopefully them having, or some, getting feedback from customers or their own personal experience saying, yes, this one has that expansive, uplifting quality. So if people know what they're selling, I would ask for myself for this kind of work, I would ask for a sativa leaning hybrid. Like a haze sometimes can be really good. There's a number of strains that can be like that, but something that's awakening and enlivening in that sense, but still has enough of a like a relaxing or calming quality. You don't want something that's like, like, well, most people don't, some do, but for this kind of work, I'd say probably not. Um, and again, experiment, like go to the shop or whatever, get two or three different cultivars, have one toke, sit down, shut up and pay attention, see how that feels. If you like it or you want to go deeper, have another one a little later and stay with your cushion for as long as you can, etc. And then if that one, in my experience, only a minority of strains have the what I would call the spiritual force. So I'm picky about what I'll smoke for this kind of use because others they just don't do it. Sometimes it's just how you feel that day,
Hmm.
or who knows, maybe it's even the alignment of the planets or the stars that day, full moon, new moon, whatever can affect things. But if there's any consistency with the material itself, I would say that you have to experiment until you find one that go, yeah, I can be really present with this one. It's strong, but it's also expansive and relaxing, right? Yeah. So those are the kind of maybe the two kind of key things about dosage and strain. Yeah.
One of the things too that we have now that we didn't have certainly when I was younger is that the idea of using CBD as a way of sort of backing out of it if you take too much.
Hmm. Well, you know what? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you have read some things that I haven't or heard stories that I haven't. I'm not quite sure if CB does that after the fact. I haven't actually read that it has that diminishing or mitigating effect to bring you down later. What I have read a bunch is that uh, at the same in the same plant, um, it does mitigate. Apparently, it interferes with where the receptor, it gets in there first or something. I don't know the science. Maybe somebody watching this does. I have read about it, but it's a detail I didn't remember. It interferes with the uptake, so to speak, of THC to some degree. And what I've read is that it sort of somewhat diminishes the effect of the THC, but it also prolongs the effect of the THC. So that could be kind of cool too. So there are all kinds of different mixtures. There's like 1-to-1, for example, THC and CBD. So CBD on its own isn't mind altering particularly, although some people say that they do have a degree of mind altering experience with CBD. It has other effects. And yeah, so yeah, I don't know if you can use it. I wouldn't automatically assume that you can use it for bringing down an uncomfortable high. So actually, let me say something briefly about that. Excuse me. Two things. One is up to a point, um, you may be able to work with it because a lot of it's just what I said earlier. It's like you're not handling the strength of that particular, dosage right then. But that's not fixed. It's not fixed in concrete. You may be able to just keep breathing. For example, I've had people a couple of times experienced where they fainted in my cannabis ceremonies that I lead. And this one guy, he just got dizzy. I saw him. I watched him over on the other side of the circle, kind of like being, no offense to him, but sort of greedy. It's like people think they got to have a lot of this, right away, like I was saying. And so he, while the rest of us were starting off with one good sized toke of some, high THC material, he's over there having three. And then at a certain point in the ceremony, we were doing some Om chanting and we were standing up kind of in a circle, putting our arms around each other, going, Om, and he got dizzy. and he started to faint, like he'd actually started to fall right there. So we walked him over to the couch, and I said, lie down, but don't buy into any thinking and keep breathing. Just breathe, let your thoughts go as much as you can. And he went over there for 10 minutes, did that, and 10 minutes later, he was totally fine, right? So that's perhaps the first line of first aid, so to speak. If you feel like you've had too much, that's tougher if you've eaten it because it has a much longer duration, right? If you've taken it orally, with smoking, that can change fairly quickly. Um, so if something like that doesn't work, there are a few other things, and I'm not quite aware of all of them. I'm told that coffee can help
Hmm.
bring you down. Some people say that orange juice,
Shower.
a
Right.
shower, yes, absolutely. There's some other, and eating things, uh, heavier foods with sugar in them, I think can interfere with the high, bring you down. Like when we do ceremonies, we don't eat for that reason because it's a kind of a more of like a ethereal or airy, spacious kind of thing, and the food, brings in this other factor, this sort of heavier factor, right? So, yeah, there is a few things, and I'm sure if somebody wants to know, you could just Google, ways to bring down a high. There's a few of them around. I don't remember them all at the moment, but I would say again, if that happens to anyone who's watching this, and their intention is they really do want to use cannabis as a spiritual ally, it can be really effective and it can be really, useful that way. But if you overdo it, I would say try to work with it first. Like try to work with your breath. Let go of those thoughts. They're just thoughts, right? No praise, no
Hmm.
blame. And it's going to be over in an hour or two or whatever anyway, just like a tough psychedelic experience. They say, yeah, you might go through some rough patches, but you're going to be, back to base camp in a few hours and you're going to be okay. So, like, don't buy into the thoughts again, especially paranoid ones, where you feel exposed or whatever. It's just a thought. It doesn't actually exist other than a thought in that moment, right? And you can let it go and just keep coming back to the breath. I can't emphasize the benefit or power or usefulness of breath enough. The breath is almost like our teacher, our guru, our guide, our savior. If your breath just brings you back into the body, it helps you relax, keeps you grounded. And if we're in our heads, we oftentimes aren't paying attention to our breath, and it can get quite shallow. So you can do things like put a finger on your belly button and make sure the breath is getting way down in there. Breath is a healer. Breath is our life in that sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Breath.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all ways of even having, I mean, before people were doing psychedelic stuff, people were having psychedelic experiences just by using their breath.
Oh,
So,
yeah. 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 Have you ever heard of Stanislav Grof?
no.
Oh, well, he's quite famous in the psychedelic world. Um, he was the head psychiatrist of I think it was the Prague, Czechoslovakia Psychiatric Hospital. And LSD was legal until the late 1960s. So, starting, I think, in 1953, for the next 13 years or so, he oversaw or supervised or whatever, like well over 1,000 sessions with psychiatric patients in that hospital with LSD at varying doses, and had, um, by all accounts, immense success. It tended to take people into where their primary trauma was, and allow it to come up, which is sort of, the kind of the Bible of healing is you have to see it, you have to allow it to come up from underground, so to speak, and then hopefully you can talk about it or release it or whatever. The wounds that have been hidden and blocking you and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, people, if they're in a psychiatric hospital, they've had some pretty serious trauma oftentimes. So he did that for 13 years. And then at some point, he came to the United States, but by then LSD was illegal. So he still wanted people to get into these states. So he came up with something. I don't know if he just invented it out of the blue or where he got it from, but he called it holotropic breath work or
Hmm.
holotropic breathing. And I've done a session of that twice actually. And basically what they do is they ask you to get breathing as hard as you can, like hyperventilating, deep breaths and forceful exhalation. And and then they often put on some fairly intense music, like beautiful music, but more kind of hard driving or something. Maybe is the way I experienced it anyway. Powerful music of some kind or another, and fairly loud. And then you're breathing away, and Groff and many others, because he trained a lot of people, or a lot of people learned to do this kind of work as a substitute for the now illegal LSD, claimed that people had a lot of the same kinds of experiences where they were, powerfully altered. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, well, we
Um,
used to do something when I was a kid. I don't know if it was safe. Obviously, I was like a teenager, but we would do this thing where you take a breath and then you breathe out as you went bent that over and inhale as you
oh
bent
yeah.
back up. You do it like 10 times really fast. And then somebody would push you up against the wall and you'd exhale it all and hold it for as long as you could.
Yeah.
And then you'd just sort of like black out for a little while.
Hmm.
I
Yes,
don't
we
know what
love
that.
we love altered experiences, don't we? It's actually one of the arguments for why it's absolutely hopeless to try to banish um,
Right.
substances that would give you altered experiences, because there's an innate human drive to alter our
I
consciousness.
know. Why do people go to the gym?
Yeah, even the
You
gym
know?
will do that. Um, uh, like kids love to spin until they get dizzy, right?
Hmm.
Just like the feeling of something different that way, some kind of alteration. So yeah. Anyway, uh, I should probably get going. I have to go help my brother-in-law with something, and he's waiting for me basically at this time. Do you have any other questions you want to ask us? Maybe one more if you want to
What
finish it up.
No, but if you have anything that you want to say, if you want to like summarize on, how people could use cannabis as a psychedelic and have a spiritual type of awareness from it, like a short, brief summary, that'd be cool.
Yeah, well, I'll keep it really short because I think I've said most of the things that I
Yeah.
think are important to say that way. So just it can be an excellent spiritual ally. As I said at the beginning, it maybe requires some respect and some reverence, the right kind of situation where you have some calm and quiet around you, and for at least part of the time that you do it, if the session, so to speak, if you could just try to sit down, shut up, and pay attention and follow the breath, you might find, I hope you would find, that you can enter into the open space that allows you to go deeper into your real self, that you can open up your body and mind. That's one of the beauties, or almost unique among psychedelics, capability of cannabis is that it works with the mind and the body synchronistically, together, integratedly, holistically. Not necessarily the same as psilocybin or ayahuasca in that regard. Cannabis, to have its spiritual effect, it has to be embodied. It's a reality medicine, but it's a physical kind of a medicine in that way. So the more you can let go physically, the more you open up. But that comes along with quieting the mind as much as possible. Of course, there's also what Buddhists and other traditions might call one-pointed type meditations, where you concentrate on something like an external focus of some
Hmm.
kind. And cannabis can do that too, as long as it's not too cerebral. I find it's really interesting with music because I play music, but I'm not a master of my instrument. I'm not bad on the guitar and singing, but I'm not a professional in that way. In that I can just play anything I want, whatever's coming through my mind. I haven't gotten to that level, and so maybe if you do, like maybe if you're truly an amazing master musician, cannabis can just simply help you go deeper into it. And again, that would be dose dependent, probably. But for me, I'm at a level of musicianship where sometimes it can throw me off because it does interfere with some of your what they sometimes call executive function, you know. But the really interesting thing is if I can really relax and enter in, it's as I said before, it's a nowness medicine, right? It potentially allows you to go deeper into this moment, and like I just did this last night playing with a friend, and once I kind of settled in more, I was able to, like we do some soloing, improvising, you know, where one
Hmm.
person will carry the rhythm on the guitar and the other person will do some soloing. And I did some, I think, remarkable solos, quite honestly, where it becomes effortless, right?
Hmm.
Your spirit is guiding you through it in a sense, even though my chops are somewhat limited. Like I can't go, I don't play fast like that, but I can get into the groove. And so cannabis has that potential to deepen you in that way, for certain kinds of creative activity that are nowness focused and not overly cerebral focused in that moment, at least, right? In my intent or contention. But I would just ask or suggest to people again that the deepest, purest, ultimate potential of this plant is where, at least for part of the time that you're working with it, you try to get yourself out of the way altogether without any external distractions or activities or anything, and just be with it and allow whatever comes up to come up. And oftentimes, if you get the right strain and the right dosage, you'll settle into a really, you can settle into a really beautiful space that you know as real. It just feels right. You know, it just feels calm. It feels open-hearted. It feels
Hmm.
present. You know, like that. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. And before we wrap it up, where's the best place for my listeners to find you?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question. I appreciate it, Gary. My website is stephengrayvision.com. So it's StephenGray, like the title or the author name on
Hmm.
this book here. Stephen Gray Vision. Stephen Gray are mushed together as two words usually on that. But the website is Stephen Gray Vision, all one word. But I have a YouTube channel, which is Stephen Gray, all one word, and then Vision separately. And it's for interviewing leading influencers in psychedelics and consciousness change. I would also like to mention to anyone either that can come in person or online, we have a wonderful conference in Vancouver that's been going for 12 years with a lot of the most important spokespeople in the field, called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, spiritplantmedicine.com. And if anyone who is watching or listening to this, we are at the second early bird stage of ticket selling now. We try to keep our price quite reasonable compared to some of these kinds of conferences. We're very aware of accessibility issues for some people financially, so we
Hmm.
try to keep it reasonable. In any case, we're at the 35% discount early bird price, but uh, I'm offering people my personal discount code, which is Stephen, Stephen, and that will get you 50% off the going price, the full price.
And when
Okay.
is it happening?
It's November 3rd to 5th. It's a wonderful conference. We do everything in the same room, so there's a real kind of ceremonial feel to it as
Hmm.
well. Real connection energy, community energy, networking energy at that conference. It's in Vancouver, British Columbia. So yeah, and there's contact info on my website if you want to write me, et cetera, et cetera. And I also would really like it if people subscribe to my newsletter. And I think you can do that. I have someone who takes care of this, so I'm not much of a technical guy myself. I think you can subscribe there at my website, right on the homepage, where I think it'll say subscribe or something like that. But worst case scenario, you can contact me, and write to me and say, yeah, Stephen, I'd like to be on your newsletter. I use it sparingly and respectfully. I don't put I don't put stuff out all the time like some
Hmm.
people do. I use it to announce things like the conference or an upcoming ceremony or or event, and also to put in some little, hopefully, nuggets of wisdom or whatever on certain related topics. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll put those links in the notes of this episode so my
Yeah.
listeners can find you and go to your conference, buy your books, check out your YouTube channel. And it's been a pleasure having you on again. Good to see
Oh,
you.
thank you. Oh, likewise. And thank you for, I like the way you open the field up. You know, you ask a question and you let me ramble for a while, and gives me a chance to really clarify my thinking for people, to
Hmm.
share my, my understanding. Oh, if you don't mind, I'd also like to mention that I don't know, hopefully soon you're going to publish a
Yes.
group discussion interview we did about the How Psychedelics Can Help Save the
Yeah.
World book. And I hope people will check that out as well,
Yes.
because
Awesome
there was some
episode.
really, oh yeah, there were some brilliant people on that, right? You
Yeah.
felt that way, right,
Yeah,
Gary?
definitely.
Yeah,
It was an
yeah,
honor to
yeah.
host it. Thanks for putting that together.
Oh yeah. So yeah, let me know when you put that out, and I will immediately share it and so on, as with this one.
All
Yeah.
right. Awesome. Well, thank you for being on. And with that, I'm going to play the outro. And if you have to run, that is okay.
I will run. Well, at least I'll walk anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good
Okay.
one. Bye.
Thanks again, Gary. Bye.